I do rise to speak on this report because the works to be done in Western Australia to facilitate the rotational force there are important. Because of the way these things are tabled, not being a member of the committee, I've only just received the report, but what it highlights is that Defence is proceeding with what they're calling their optimal pathway towards developing our capabilities to support SSN submarines, both those that are rotating through from the US and UK down the track, as in the within the decade, the hopefully 3 SSN that will be sold to Australia by the United States, and then eventually the SSN AUKUS, which is the submarine built with the UK. Now, at the moment, that optimal pathway is based around the assumption that the best way to get additional capability for the US forces in the Pacific to provide the deterrent factor which people are looking for is to build new submarines, hence the investment in US boat yards, both HII and EB, Electric Boat, to build new Virginia-class submarines. And that's good, I support that. But the target of getting to 2.33 submarines out of those yards in what the Americans are now calling the speed of relevance, i.e. before the peak threat of conflict in our region, which is late this decade, will make it very difficult to get the sort of numbers that they need to provide that deterrent factor and that we expect the US to need in order for a future president to sign off on the sale. Now, I'm still optimistic that that will occur. As a former experimental test pilot, as I've often said before, I'm an optimist by nature, almost by definition. But we could make that job easier if we looked at the Congressional Research Service report, which was provided to the US Congress as part of their preparatory works for debating the AUKUS legislation. And what that highlights is that the new build of submarines is a pathway that they support, but they also highlight that there are 18 Virginia SSN which are in a backlog of maintenance. And they're in a backlog of maintenance because there are insufficient shipyard facilities to do the work, there are insufficient workers, and there's insufficient capacity within their supply chain. Now, if you look back through history, Australia during World War II actually provided one of the largest operating and maintenance bases for UK and US submarines in the world. And we have the capacity in Australia, as we have demonstrated through our joint maintenance of things like the Mark 48 ADCAP torpedo, as we demonstrate through our maintenance for the Collins-class submarine, to do the work that is required for complex weapon systems. And the solution that has not been widely discussed but is a viable solution worthy of consideration is saying, rather than having an optimal pathway, which this report endorses as the preparatory works, that will get us by the mid-2030s with the workforce and the infrastructure in particular, this report goes to the infrastructure, to do deep-level maintenance, what we would call a full-cycle docking on the Collins. The Americans have a different term, but it's that deep maintenance. Rather than investing slowly in this crawl, walk, run process that gets us there by 2030, if that were compressed such that we could assist the US to remediate those 18 boats, or some of those 18 boats, ahead of the end of this decade, what that then does is two things. In the US interest, it means that they get to the commander of the Pacific Fleet more SSN Virginias to increase the deterrent effect that that force at Indo-PACOM have in our region, which decreases the likelihood of conflict. That's a win for them, and it's a win for the region, including us. It also means that the win for us is that we can actually invest now in building the capability and workforce within our industry to do the work that we need to get done by the mid or early 2030s anyway, and so we actually incentivise, through contracts, companies to start employing people for this work, to bring them, for example, with the offshore patrol vessel contract being halved. In my discussions with industry, there is workforce there from the Transcap program on the Anzac, some of the new joint ventures that are being stood up, including British firms such as Babcock, who already work in the US. There are opportunities there for workforce to be focused on this task. There is also spare capacity in many elements of Australian industry. So, for example, in South Australia we have McTaggart Scott, who is as you would probably guess, a company that has its origins in Scotland, but McTaggart Scott UK not only support the British submarines, but they also support the US. McTaggart Scott Australia has spare capacity from their work on our submarines and could support the US. And I've spoken to many companies who indicate the same thing, that given a contract and a task, they could step up to support the supply chain for the US. So what are some missing pieces if that were to happen in a meaningful way? Well, there's two. One is that the US would have to change their legislation, because at the moment their legislation requires that deep maintenance is done in a US port. And I understand their reasons for that in terms of sovereign capability and workflow, but right at the moment it's actually harming their national interests, not helping, because they've got 18 boats in a backlog. They should only have 10 or less at any given time, according to their strategic planning, but this congressional research report indicates that they've got 18. And that's harming their ability to get deterrent capability. It's harming our prospects of a future US president saying, I'm comfortable to sign off, sell the 3 SSN Virginia to Australia. So there's an interest for them in making something like this work, and there's an interest for us in doing it. So the legislation is one thing, and given the interest to them, I don't see a problem with them dealing with that, at least in the short order, to allow this remediation to occur. The second is the facilities to do this work on a nuclear boat where the reactor has to keep running. The potential for where we're going to end up by the mid-2030s of having a land-based graving dock are not achievable. My discussions with industry, and even looking back to the Captain Cook dock in Sydney and the fact that it was built under wartime conditions but still took over 5 years, and the indications are it would take at least 5 to 6 years here. So the only solution that is viable is actually a floating dock. And there are floating docks that have been certified to lift Virginia SSN out of the water and keep the reactors running. And industry tell me that that can be built in under 2 years. So just as we have contributed funding to US shipyards for the building of new boats, were the US to say, yes, this would be a benefit because we could get more boats more quickly to our warfighters in the Pacific, an investment by them in a floating dock to operate off Henderson would be the starting point to focus our industry, our workforce, our productive capacity to remediate some of, even 1 or 2 of, those 18 boats, which would help deter conflict and help improve the chances of making sure that we also get those SSN Virginia down the track. The other benefit for us long-term is that the graving dock in Sydney is badly in need of an upgrade, but it's the only one we have for vessels that size, and so we can't take it out of service at the moment. Were this floating dock to be in place, they could build the graving dock in the west on their original timeline into the 2030s, and then relocate the floating dock to be a facility on the east coast while the Captain Cook dock had the remediation work done there. So whilst I support the PwC's report because that proves investment in the current plan, I would argue that we need to think outside the box. If we accept the strategic imperative of both the Defence Strategic Update of 2020 and the Defence Strategic Review of 23, then we need to take steps that are not our normal way of doing business in order to deter conflict and make sure we have the industrial resilience and the military capability to win if we do, in the end, have to defend Australia and our interests.